to introduce myself for anyone who's not met me. My name is Jane Craig. I am the founding director of our charity Dyslexia Sparks. And we've arranged today's parent support group to give some more information about our dyslexia assessments, one of our key services that we offer at the charity, to give a bit more information about what that might be all about, why you might want one, whether it's the right sort of decision for your child, your young person. We are very much in demand for assessments. So we have lots of inquiries and we often get lots of questions. So this is really sort of, I'm doing it a bit like a frequently asked questions, lots of information, but also the chance to ask some questions of your own as well at the end. Okay, so I'm going to start off by talking about what benefits an assessment might bring. And there are lots of sort of varied benefits that people feel they get from that process. So first of all, there are things which I would say are about information and understanding primarily. And this will be one of the key reasons that somebody comes to us for an assessment. So they want to understand what their child's strengths are. Often, you know as a parent what your child's good at and what their strengths are. So you don't necessarily need to have that from the assessment, but it's really nice reassurance to have. And it also, for us as assessors, in terms of that process, it helps us to understand your child, your young person better. And that is all part of their profile in terms of how they're going to learn best. So, for example, if there's somebody who enjoys hands-on practical tasks and activities, that's something we can factor in when we make recommendations about their learning. So that strength, that place of strength to start with is really important. It also allows us to share in terms of feedback when we're talking to yourself after the assessment and possibly your child. It allows us to share some of that information with them. So it's not all about what things they're finding hard, for example, which is often the reason why people come to us for an assessment, because their child might be struggling in certain areas. So that's the second area that you will definitely get information about and understanding on. Information about areas they're finding hard. And again, you're probably very aware of some of that. There may be things that you're not as aware of as a parent at home. You don't see them in their learning all of the time. So there's gives you a bit more insight potentially into how they might be working at school particularly in terms of literacy. So we're looking at reading, spelling, writing, but in lots of depth, in lots of different ways and different aspects of reading, for example. And all those things are important for understanding how they're getting on, where their skills are at the moment, is there any gaps, and what that means for them in school, really. And then an understanding of why they might find some things harder than others. So often, as I say, parents will come to us knowing that their children are struggling with certain areas, but they don't necessarily know why. And that's really what the sort of crux of the assessment is understanding their cognitive profile. That means the processes that are within their brain that operate in certain ways and why that might make some things harder for them than others. So we explore different aspects of cognitive processing, such as short-term working memory, phonological awareness, which is all to do with how the brain processes sounds. And there's a lot of emphasis on that in the assessment. And speed of processing information we also look at. So all of those things will be different for everyone, and where your child sits in terms of those different things will help you to understand why some things might be more difficult for them than others. So even just going through that process at the assessment, whether or not a decision is made, whether or not dyslexia is identified, will give you lots of understanding. And a decision is not always made that a child is dyslexic. It's not, it's not always that straightforward. Sometimes we might not be able to identify that a child is dyslexic because there isn't the evidence to support that. There might be other things going on for them. But we will always find that there's something helpful comes out of that assessment process. So all parents would say that they've learned something more about their children. They understand the why better, even if that dyslexia diagnosis is not given. There's also, I would say, lots of non-measurable benefits. So all those things I've just talked about, depending on the age of your child, but pretty much all of those are done via standardized tests, which means they carry a score. Excuse me 1 minute while I let somebody in that's just asked to come in. Where's my meeting gone? There we go. Welcome, Kelly. I'm just in the middle of my second slide, so I'll carry on. So in terms of the things I've just talked about, standardized tests, which means they carry a score which can allow us to compare the performance within that test to other children, young people of the same age, to help us understand whether it is within the expected range, or it's above or it's below what we might expect for that age. So those are standardized. That's what a standardized test means. But an assessment also brings lots of non-measurable benefits. And these are the things that we really pride ourselves on being able to provide in terms of a parent and a child feeling they are supported, they're getting what they need. So one of the things that is very common is that the young person themselves, but also a parent, will feel a sense of relief often, particularly, if a decision of dyslexia is given, it's that relief that there is a reason why they're finding things tricky, and there's a way of understanding it, there's a way of explaining it, and often it provides reassurance for the parent. That their feelings about how their child's been getting on, or maybe some of the barriers they've faced, were right. And a lot of the time, you as a parent, you do know your child the best. It doesn't necessarily mean you're an expert on dyslexia, but often those feelings that you might have had for some time are reassured in terms of knowing, okay, that I was right, that they are struggling. And we meet people who have all sorts of different experiences with schools, and schools vary a lot in terms of sort of the levels of support they're giving, or the amount of support they're giving. Sometimes parents can feel like they're sort of battling a little bit with the school in terms of getting the support they need, or the acknowledgement of their child's barriers to learning. So it can often be really reassuring to have that confirmed that, these are the areas your child is struggling in, these are the areas they're good at, and this is the why. In terms of other benefits, so we provide lots of information on next steps, and they're not necessarily via the standardized test. They might be based on our experience, our knowledge of what would be best for your child to happen next. We also then can provide lots of further support in terms of the charity, the things we offer, such as the parent support group you're attending today, other things for your children to get involved in, like our ambassador project, which allows them to share their strengths with other dyslexic children. So there's lots of other things we can do to support. We can do that even if you haven't had an assessment, but if your child's had an assessment, allows us to be more specific about what might be right for them. And a benefit of an assessment, which is quite crucial to a lot of parents, is that often it opens up access to adjustments or support within the education system. So for them, that might be access to support within the classroom that they need. It might be access to support within exams. And I'll talk in a minute a little bit more about specifically how that process works. But it opens up that door often. Again, schools vary massively. There are some schools that are doing fantastic things for dyslexic children without them having necessarily had a formal assessment. But there are lots of schools where without that formal assessment, it can be a bit of a barrier, and they aren't necessarily, they're not necessarily giving that same support. So it can open that up often. Okay, so in terms of the types of assessments we offer, it's fairly straightforward, but there are a few different things listed, and you may have seen some information like this on the website. So to give you a little bit of detail about that, we offer, first of all, an assessment with verbal feedback only. The assessment process that we go through for that is exactly the same as if you decide to have a written report. The difference is that at that stage of booking that appointment, you're opting to not have the written report, but you can then choose to add that on afterwards. So some parents decide that this is a good option for them, particularly if they're not too sure maybe what the outcome might be and whether or not that written report is going to be needed. As I mentioned earlier, often, I mean, almost always, a parent will feel there's something helpful has come out of an assessment, even if a diagnosis of dyslexia is not given, and they will often opt for the written report anyway. But some parents have the assessment with verbal feedback, feel they've got what they need, pass that information onto the school verbally, and that that's, opens up that door for them enough that they don't feel the need the written report. So that is an option. The most sort of common type of assessment that we do is our standard report. So that's our standard assessment that I've just mentioned, all the same things, but with a written report. And that typically is for children of 14 and below, who are at that age stage in their education. The report is very lengthy and detailed, and it has to meet certain requirements in terms of us as professional assessors. So it is valid in terms of a diagnosis. It is valid for continuing into their education beyond the age of 14, because of the qualifications that we hold and the continuing professional development that we undertake. We also offer what we call our extended report and assessment, and that's generally for 14 and above, because that's them going into their GCSE years typically and beyond. So the extended report carries more higher level of detail, and also will normally include some additional tests to provide additional information that's needed at that age ultimately. We, in terms of the extended report, offer that in 2 ways. So that is also offered online, whereas the standard younger report is only offered face-to-face. And then we also offer a shorter assessment, which supports with what's called a Form 8. And the Form 8 is what is needed from the GCSE years onwards to access what's called exam access arrangements. So that means things like extra time in exams, which have to be applied for through the school. What we can do in conjunction with the school is support that process by offering the Form 8, and that could be an appointment booked by a parent or the school, whereby it's a shorter assessment. What we're not doing in that process is diagnosing dyslexia. What we're doing is gathering the specific evidence we would need to support an application for extra time, or maybe a reader within the exams. So that's a much shorter appointment. One of the things that we often hear from parents is that their child has gone through a screener for dyslexia at school, particularly in primary school, but often as well in secondary school this happens. And a screener can be a really helpful way to initially start to have some indication of a child's needs. But it is very different from a formal assessment, and I think it's really important that people understand that difference. So first of all, a screener is typically conducted on a computer. Not always, because they do vary, but typically. So it's a computer program, that a child will sit at and complete. They may have somebody sitting beside them to sort of help them with the technicalities of that, but typically it's done on a computer. Excuse me 1 minute while I let somebody else in. That, of course, has some limitations in terms of the way it's conducted, because it's a computer, it's not a person. There's no flexibility in that, and for some children that might be a good thing that isn't on a computer, but for other children it might not be the best way for them to complete those tasks. Our formal assessment is carried out by a person, a real person, whether it's in person or or online. There is a person sitting there talking to you, explaining the tasks you're going to do, offering reassurance, encouragement as you need it. The screener within the school would normally be administered by a school SENCO. That does vary, because there is no real qualifications required to carry out a screener in terms of setting that child up on the computer. And SENCOs vary obviously a lot across schools in terms of their experience. Some SENCOs are very experienced with working with children with special educational needs, and specifically dyslexia. Some might be very experienced across the full realm, but not specifically dyslexia. And then in some schools, unfortunately, some Senkos don't have a massive amount of experience because they've been put into that post maybe recently without much training. So that in itself obviously is important because it just varies a lot across that situation as to who's actually administering it and then dealing with whatever comes out of that screener. Our formal assessment is carried out by a dyslexia specialist. As I've mentioned, we all hold the relevant qualifications for that, which are very in-depth and need to be updated on a regular basis to ensure that that person is up to date with their qualifications and with the continuing professional development in terms of advancements in dyslexia and also the different tests that are used. So that's why I thought also being aware, just if you were to look or be looking anywhere else for a dyslexia assessment, make sure you know what that person's qualifications are. We're not a regulated authority, so that means there is no body that is checking up on us. It's down to that dyslexia individual to maintain professionalism. And in our area, there are very few people carrying out dyslexia assessments, so there's not much comparison really for our clients, but it's just worth being aware of that you need to ask those questions around what their qualifications are and how up to date they are with them. A screener, in terms of what it measures, normally measures about 4 to 5 areas at a fairly surface level. So some screeners are a bit more in depth than others, and they might go into a little bit more detail, but it tends to be quite a short, fairly quick bit of a snapshot assessment. And as I said at the beginning, that can be helpful to initially identify maybe areas of strength and concern, but it's not giving a lot of detail. So a formal assessment covers a wide range of areas and in depth. So, for example, with regards to memory, there are about 6 different individual subtests we go into to measure look at lots of different areas of memory. A screener might look at 1 or 2. So all these areas are looked at in a lot of depth. A screener typically will provide a 1-page summary. Depending on which screener the school have used, it might have a few other pages that sort of explain the information that you're being given, sort of standard template explanation, and then normally a 1-page summary of where your child has scored with maybe a visual graph or something, and then typically a sort of a conclusion statement. Our assessment report is normally around about 30 pages. It varies depending on obviously the content, but that's the typical length. So there's obviously a lot more detail in there about what your child's done, how they've got on, what that means for them, recommendations for home, for school, for the learner themselves, etc., etc. So there's a lot more detail in there. The result that the screener will present is based on algorithms. So that means that the information goes into the computer and the computer system decides the outcome. The decision in a formal assessment is based on multiple sources of information, and I'll talk to you in a minute about what those sources of information are, but that is really important because the decision about dyslexia, it's an analysis of lots of information, and it's based on experience and understanding. It's not just based on a few scores, so it's much more complex than that, which is why the screener is giving you an indication or likelihood of somebody being dyslexic. It's not giving a formal diagnosis. What quite often is seen and is a little bit more in the older screeners is risk of dyslexia, which is one of my absolute pet hates because it implies that dyslexia is, some sort of illness that you've got a risk of catching. But that's still the terminology in some of the screeners. So an indication, a likelihood or risk of dyslexia, normally on a scale of how likely that person is to be dyslexic or how dyslexic they are, which in the professional world of dyslexia is no longer advised in terms of giving a severity of dyslexia. A person is dyslexic or not dyslexic, and their profile is specific according to their strengths and weaknesses. So a formal assessment gives a formal decision, a diagnostic decision, which is obviously been made by somebody who's qualified to make that decision, and therefore access to support because it's a recognised formal decision about dyslexia. Okay, so that's just to help understand the differences between the two. We do meet people whose child has had a screener, and in their head, their child is dyslexic. And that, I think, can be, a little bit of an issue in terms of communication from the school, because a screener is not deciding a child is dyslexic, it's indicating they might be. And hopefully most of the time it's right in that, but they're not always accurate. And because of these algorithms, there can be quite a lot of screeners that would say a child isn't dyslexic based on what's going into that algorithm, whatever their however it's working out in terms of these different factors. So it can be, it's just needs to be, you need to be careful about placing too much weight on it, whether it's saying dyslexia or not, really. And conversely, very typical, we'll meet people who've had screeners at school that have been inconclusive or have said they're not dyslexic, and then a dyslexia assessment with us makes it very clear that they are. And that, again, in my view, is based on those screeners and how they've been designed in terms of accuracy, really. But the whole process that they're going through is very different. Okay, so one of the things that we said we would cover on this session is to help you decide, does my child need assessment? Majority of people who come to us are very, sure that that's what their child needs, but there can be people who are less sure and need a bit of guidance with that. Ultimately, we would say it is down to you. It's your decision about whether the child needs assessment. We can't make that decision for you, but obviously we can help to try and guide that. So a few things that I think are worth considering in terms of whether they need an assessment. So first of all, are they finding literacy hard? Because dyslexia, in its definition, has to really, we need to see some impact of that dyslexia on the literacy. And that will vary across people in terms of the different areas they might find hard or they might be struggling in, and sort of the extent of that. But then we need, in order to be able to support that diagnosis of dyslexia, we need to be able to show there's some impact. So what I mean by that is, there may be that there's aspects of reading that they find hard and they're below where we'd expect for their age. It might be spelling, it might be writing. So those are the key areas that we need to show that there is some sort of impact. There's something going on that's not where we'd expect for their age. Within that, there's lots of scope for us to be able to identify weaknesses on a more specific basis. So some children, for example, might be managing to comprehend what they read by using lots of other clues within what they're reading. They may be quite regular readers, perhaps because you support them a lot with that at home. They may be read to a lot as well, which will help with the comprehension. But when it comes to, for example, reading the individual words or reading a word they've never seen before, maybe that's where they're struggling more. Conversely, you might have a child who's learned the phonics side of things fairly well, although that would be probably unusual within most dyslexic children, but then is struggling to put it all together in terms of comprehension. So there's lots of nuances within that, lots of specific differences that we'll see across profiles, but in terms of identifying dyslexia, we do need to see some impact on literacy. That is also based on observations. So if in the assessment they manage to achieve within the average range, but we can see that it's incredibly hard work for them and they're having to read, reread, take time. We look at speed of reading, need lots of extra time for decoding, but manage to achieve within the expected range. Those things would be taken into account. So it's not just about the score that they achieve on a certain test that we use. Another thing that would normally you would see in terms of your child and their working or their daily life is difficulties with short-term and or working memory. And that within daily life would often relate to things like recall of information or following instructions. So short-term memory is about how much they can hold just for a few seconds. So if you tell them a few things at once, are they forgetting parts of that? Working memory is a bit of a multitasker, so it helps to maintain concentration, but it also helps to store information while we're doing other things. So, for example, if you're reading with them and they stop to decode to work out an unknown word, does that mean that they forget what they've read before? That may be an indication of working memory difficulties. Do they find it hard to process information at speed or complete timed tasks? Because that would give you some indication that speed of processing is difficult for them. They may find it hard to take in information at the same speed as other children their age, or get overwhelmed when there's too much information coming in. So that would be another indicator that they may be dyslexic, and therefore an assessment might be helpful. And another thing that I think is really important to consider is, are they getting the support they need at school? And so often this is why parents come to us for an assessment, is because their child isn't getting the support they need at school. But we do meet parents for whom their child is getting a certain level of support at school. And at that stage, the question would be, is an assessment needed? What else is it going to bring? For some parents, that might be that they're moving, for example, up to high school, and they've had lots of support at primary school, but not a formal recognition of their needs, and therefore they want that in place, which makes absolute sense. And I've carried out a couple of assessments like that very recently, Year 6 children who have had quite a lot of support, but the school didn't feel they needed to have that recognised formally at SEN level. But what that means is when they move up to secondary, it might be hard to access that because it's not formally recognised. So are they getting the support they need at school? The other thing that I would mention here is that if a child has other things going on in terms of their SEN needs, what will a dyslexia assessment bring on top of that? So, for example, if a child, as we do meet children who have been identified as autistic, identified maybe with ADHD, and they're receiving support for those things, it's just important to consider what will this dyslexia assessment bring that will be different from the support they're already receiving. Because sometimes the typical dyslexia support we would recommend may not work or may not be as effective, for example, for an autistic child, because their needs are very specific to that. And obviously it depends very much on their profile, but it's just really worth considering, is this going to bring anything in addition or anything different in terms of the support they're receiving? Is it needed? So just worth thinking about that. That tends to be quite unusual, tends to be more less common. The other thing that I would say is really important in terms of considering an assessment is your child ready for an assessment? And this again is not common, but we do meet children who come for an assessment who, for lots of different reasons, are not ready to be able to undertake that assessment process. And that can be very difficult for them, the parent, and us, because we want to help, we want to support, we want to give you the information you're looking for, but we have to get through the assessment process. So firstly, just in case you're not aware, we do undertake assessments typically from the age of 7. So if your child is not 7, you could certainly be inquiring, because as I will get on to a little bit later on, we do have a waiting list. But typically, the nearer they are to 7, the harder it is to make that decision about dyslexia. And that can be hard because you'll see lots of information talked about, it's better to get an early diagnosis. And we would agree, understanding a child's profile of strengths and weaknesses as early as possible is generally a positive thing. But in terms of the assessment process and the tests we use, our experience tells us that it can be quite tricky, generally below the age of 8, which is what used to be recommended for assessments, 8+. It can sometimes be hard to gauge whether those difficulties they're having are to do with their sort of levels of maturity in schooling, or whether it's dyslexia. It can be difficult. So we do carry out from the age of 7, but we would generally encourage children to be a little bit older. Of course, the other thing is that at the age of 7, they may struggle with the assessment process, which I'll go on and talk about a little now. So they need to be able to undertake reading, spelling and writing tasks independently. So we, as I've mentioned already, we will be there to support, we will encourage, but we can't prompt a child to continue in terms of moving them on or asking them further questions, because what the tests we use now are standardized, that means we have limitations on what we can say within the tests. Otherwise, we invalidate the outcome. So if they are really going to struggle with doing those things independently, then we need to consider whether now is the right time for them in terms of undertaking those tasks. The whole assessment process takes around 2 hours, sometimes a bit longer, depending on the age of the child and how they're getting on, how much time they need. We do take occasional breaks, but they do need to be able to maintain concentration, attention for around a total of 2 hours with those short breaks. We can't give them multiple short breaks throughout frequently, otherwise it would take, potentially 3-4 hours, and that isn't probably going to be very good for them, but it certainly, would be impractical for us as well. So they do need to be able to maintain concentration for around that length of time. Now, the tasks we're doing are typically fairly short, and they're broken up, and we vary them across the course of the assessment so that they're not doing, for example, reading task, reading task, reading task, reading task. We'd mix reading with other things, and there are things they're doing that are not the typical school stuff, reading, spelling, writing. They're doing other things like word games and puzzles. So those things, we can dip in and out of. And adjust within the assessment to try and maintain their attention, concentration. But that's still, we've only got so much flexibility within that. So we need to be aware that's what they need to be able to do. And if, in terms of your child, you hopefully would have some sense of that from school. And if not, you could maybe ask the teacher, how long do they manage for? Lesson blocks at school, typically 40 minutes to an hour, depending on the child. Are they managing for that amount of time without lots of difficulties in terms of concentration, attention? And are they emotionally ready? So the reason I say this is because, some children, even though we do lots to prepare in terms of helping them prepare for the assessment, and I'll talk to you about that, we operate in a very informal way in terms of our interactions with the child, and we try to make it as relaxed, fun and friendly as possible. Some children will build that up for themselves and feel like they're going to go into a test, as much as we try to avoid it feeling like that. They're coming somewhere new, they've typically never been before. They're meeting someone new they've typically never met before. So all those things can be a little bit anxiety provoking. They might make them feel a bit nervous, which is absolutely normal, and that's fine. We can cope with that. We can support them with that. You can support them with that. But some children would find that a lot harder than others. And even with all of those sort of support tools in place, might not be emotionally ready, might find it too overwhelming, too nerve-wracking. So you need to consider whether your child is emotionally ready. And what we're trying to avoid here is children coming for an assessment before they're ready, and then potentially having a little bit of a negative view of that. So then when you maybe want to try and bring them back for an assessment, them feeling a certain way about it. We want them to feel like it's a positive experience and a fun experience, which is what most children would report from our assessment process. And we don't want them feeling put off from that. So even if it means them waiting a little bit longer, it might be that that's better for your child. It's all about what's right for them. So a little bit more information in terms of what happens during the assessment. This is to give you a bit of an insight as to how things work and what this means for them. So I've mentioned it's around 2 to 2.5 hours, depending on their age and what they're doing and how they do it. It is a series of short activities. So as I say, we break them up and we mix them up, so they're not doing all the same things at the same time. We also have the flexibility within the assessment appointment to move things around to some extent. So, for example, if upon arriving, when we're getting to know a child initially, they tell us, they absolutely detest reading and it's their most hated thing, we might not do that as the first activity. We might do something else first to try and relax them a little and ease them in. But we might have other children who say, I'd like to get it out of the way. I'd rather do that first. So we work with them and we do what we can to adjust. It's carried out in a relaxed way. We pride ourselves on being friendly, and that's what people report about us. We are carrying out a professional service, so it has to be done in a certain way, but in a relaxed way is our favourite way of doing it. And some adaptation to that environment is possible. But as I've mentioned, tests have to be carried out according to certain rules in order to be standardised. So, for example, if a child is a bit fidgety, they might sit with a fidget toy in their hands, and that's absolutely fine. Or they might sit on a wobble cushion. And we've got things like that to support them, and we no issue at all, with giving them what they need so that they can perform as well as they can within the assessment environment. We might make sure we take a couple of extra breaks if that's needed for that child. So some things we can adapt, but as I say, the tests have to be conducted in terms of certain rules, so we can't adapt everything and we can't change. For example, certain things you're only allowed to repeat the question once. We can't do it twice, otherwise then the result would be invalidated. So there's certain things we have to adhere to. Question we get asked quite a lot is, can I be in the room? Should I be in the room? Do I wait? So we will work with what your child needs. You know your child best, and you will probably know how they'll work best in terms of that assessment process. So some children, do get themselves very nervous about it. That's something that they need support with, and they feel they'll be more comfortable and more able to perform for that assessment with you there with them in the room. Then we will accommodate that. Within our centre, wherever the assessment is carried out, we've got a waiting room that's nearby. It's either next to the room or very nearby. So you have the option to wait there if that works for your child, if they're comfortable with that, but they want you nearby. Also, some parents will leave and come back, and as long as the child's comfortable with that, that's fine with us as well. So it's what your child needs. You might have some idea of that before you arrive. Some of it might be determined when you arrive, but we'll work with you and be flexible. Most children we find will work better on a one-to-one basis, so them and us alone, because it means less distractions. So you may feel you're being there to support them, but that might be a distraction for them. It can be. And in terms of the assessment process, there's lots of the tests we carried out that need to be done with no other noise going on. They need to be done with no other distractions, because it allows them to focus completely on that test, and that's according to the test conditions. So, if you consider for 2.5 hours, you might have to sit there and pretty much be quiet and do nothing. That can be a bit of a challenge. And so where possible, we normally find one-to-one works better. But as I say, some children will struggle with that, and therefore we'll be flexible. As I've mentioned, the tests are standardised, which means any interruption to that test condition invalidates the test. So you may be able to offer reassurance to your child, but you cannot prompt. So what that means is, if they were looking at a list of words on an easel in front of them and they're not saying anything, and you say, oh, just have a look at that one, you know what that first letter is, that would invalidate the test. Or a parent says, oh, go on, have another go, that would invalidate the test. And I think it's understandable. It's quite hard to not do that when you're if you're in that environment and your child is maybe finding something a bit tricky. What you will be able to do is, in between tests, offer some reassurance. Say, oh, you did well there, you're doing great, keep going. Or a bit of conversation in between, because what we do is we also ask the children lots of questions about the things they're doing, what they enjoy. How did you find that? Did you think it was easy, tricky? Were you using anything to help you? So there's times where we're conversation in between, but during those tests, you can't directly offer that prompting. And there are, as I mentioned, some tests where things are only heard once, and there's lots of listening activities in here. If you, for example, were to cough or sneeze or some loud noise that meant they didn't hear it, we wouldn't be able to include that. So we just have to be really careful about parents being in. Yes, definitely we can accommodate if it's needed, but there's some certain things we need to be aware of. In terms of the assessment and what we take into account when making a decision about dyslexia, I mentioned when we were looking at screener versus assessment that there's lots of information taken into account. So yes, we use the information gathered during the assessment via those standardised tests. Just to mention, while I'm using that word again, we typically would not use the word test with the children at all. I would always refer to them as activities. I think a lot of children have got a lot of hang-ups around tests because of school, and as soon as they're told you're going to go for a test, it provokes something in them in terms of possibly negativity nerves. So we don't refer to that when we're talking about them with the children. But they are standardized tests, and that's what we're getting in terms of information. So those scores that I mentioned that help us to map where the child is at the moment on those different aspects. We also take into account the background information from you as parent, and that's really crucial because you're giving us your insight outside of the assessment process. The assessment process is 2.5 hours of that child's life where we get some information and get to see them in action. And it can be very, very insightful, but it's not everything. The background information will ask you things about their early development because there are things there that are important in terms of deciding dyslexia. It'll ask you about things like what they like at school, which the child might be able to tell us about, but sometimes they may not give us all that information. So that's all very important information. Things like, is there a family history of dyslexia or suspected dyslexia is important because there are typically lots of links, genetic links within the dyslexia world. So all of that is really important. We also ask for background information from the school college, but we ask you to obtain that. So when you book an assessment appointment, you'll be sent a link to 2 online questionnaires, and one is for you to complete and one is to send to the school. Now, sometimes that can be hard to obtain depending on how sort of, busy, cooperative your school are, but we ask you to do that part. If you're really struggling, sometimes we can step in and directly contact the school college, but in the first instance, we ask you to do that. And you do need to allow a bit of time for that, because schools typically, school staff are busy. And if you, for example, ask them to do it sort of a few days before the assessment, you might not be giving them enough chance to get that done. So at least a few weeks before would be what I'd recommend. We also make observations of the child. So what that means is, we're watching them carry out the tasks. How are they doing it? How are they approaching it? Are they looking really stressed, confused? Are they using strategies? So are they, for example, repeating things out loud? All of these things that help us to build up that picture of the child and their profile. And I mentioned earlier on, for example, if let's say they manage to achieve within the expected range for something, but we can see that there's lots of difficulties going on, those are all valid sources of information for us. And then also we're taking on board information provided by the child themselves or you at the appointment or during the feedback process. So sometimes, during the appointment or afterwards, or during feedback, additional things come to light, which are really important, helpful as well. So all of that background stuff, current stuff, information from you, from your child, from the school is all taken into account in terms of helping us make our decision about whether that child is dyslexic. Okay, so in terms of preparing your child for an assessment, if you decide to go down that route, I've mentioned a few times that it's important to do that and help them feel as comfortable as possible. So number one, you will be sent a PowerPoint which explains what happens in an assessment. And the idea of that is to sit and look at that with your child. And that is to go through some of the things that I've mentioned already in here, to, from their perspective, help them understand why they're coming, what it involves, and help reassure them, hopefully, if they're feeling anxious about any parts of that. It allows them to see the person they're going to meet, their individual assessor. So they've had a view of that. It allows them to see images of the building. So all of those things are really good ways to help prepare your child. Outside of that, we would say as well, just reassure them this appointment is about finding out more about them and how they learn. It's not like a school test, and there's vast majority of children, as I say, would come out saying they had fun, they enjoyed it. Not absolutely every child does, and that's fine, but most would say it's very different to school. Our environment we work in is not like a school. As I say, we're very relaxed. We use first name basis for all of our staff, so that it's not Mrs. Craig, it's Jane. I'm Jane, and I'm going to find out, about you and what you like, what you don't like, and I'm asking you questions straight away to relax you. But in advance, that's the sort of thing you can say to them. This is just about finding out more about you. We know there's some things you find a bit tricky, and we'd like to, understand that a bit better so that we can help you the best we can. I think it's also really important to validate any feelings they might have around nervousness. And not all children do feel nervous, but it is quite common that they will arrive and feel nervous because, as I say, they've never met us before. They've never been to the building before. Hopefully they've seen us and seen the building because of the PowerPoint, but it's an unusual experience for them. But validate that it's okay to feel nervous and it's quite normal. If we say to them, you don't need to feel nervous, that isn't necessarily going to stop them from feeling nervous. It's generally better just to validate that, yes, that's fine and that's quite normal. And I'm sure when you get there, you'll feel more relaxed, but we can talk to the assessor about that. And I think that's the other thing to be aware of. When you arrive, the assessor will always ask how you are or ask you how your child is. Just be open with them. Oh yeah, they're feeling a bit nervous actually or they're feeling a bit nervous about it. That's fine. We'll work with that. And it's good for us to know that that's how they're feeling at that point in time. And we can normally get a sense of how quickly a child relaxes once they're in the assessment. And I normally would check in with them about that. How are you feeling now? You said you were a bit nervous at the beginning, and typically they relax very quickly. A few practicalities to give you. So 1 week prior to the assessment, we would ask that you've completed the necessary background information. So your questionnaire and the school have. As I say, you might be having to chase them a little bit for that, unfortunately, but just do your best in terms of getting that. In order for the assessment to take place, we really do need your background information, at least. If we don't have the school stuff, we can still do the assessment, but it really helps for us in terms of making that decision about dyslexia and also writing up the report if that's the option you go for. But having the family one really helps us prepare as well. Because, for example, if your child does struggle with anxiety generally, that's really helpful for us to know in advance, so we know, what to expect. If they have certain preferences about people, that may be shy, that again would help us to prepare. So those things are really important for us to have in advance. The school one, ideally, but not essential for the assessment to take place. And you make sure you've paid any remaining balance, which is just kind of a practicality, but which some people leave very last minute and makes things a bit tricky for us because then we're having to chase. And we are providing a service which we need to make sure we're not going to be left in debt for afterwards. Basically, you will have been sent an invoice separately via email when you book the appointment, and on there is bank details, or you can phone up and make payment. So ideally, we do that a week in advance. On the day of the assessment, a few practical things to consider, some of which might seem very obvious, but I know in our busy lives, some of these things get forgotten. And this is based on, obviously, the experiences we know people have in coming to us. So check the location and the map we've sent you in advance of setting off. If you look at that map and the photos of the building, it should be really straightforward. And we've also added more signage to the premises to help with that. One of the things I think people get very confused about is that we are not a building on our own. We are within a building. And the most obvious sign at that building is Enterprise Rent-A-Car. So then people see that and they think, I can't be in the right place. But we have signage on the gate. We have signage on the door. You just need to get to that point. But all the information you've been sent in advance does tell you that. So as long as you've had time to look at that, that you will know that information. So I guess actually you probably want to check the location map in advance of the day, maybe depending what time you're leaving, but at least before you set off. Fairly obvious, but allow extra time for delays. And at the moment around our area, there seems to be roadworks absolutely everywhere. So allow some extra time. Partly because, yes, we do have, a busy schedule. So it can be tricky if you're very late, but mainly because it just tends to stress you out and probably stresses your child out if you're late. So try to allow extra time. Having said that, if you arrive very early, and I would say more than 10 minutes early, try and wait in your car if possible. So this is because we do have waiting areas, but they are quite small and there is other stuff going on. And so typically it just is probably more relaxing for you and helps us out if you're not waiting in the area too early, because it allows us to make sure we're really ready and there's nothing else going on that's going to sort of make it a bit busy, for example. When you arrive, there is a sign, press buzzer 15. It can be a little bit temperamental. Make sure you can hear the buzzer making a noise. You might have to press it more than once. And then lean closely into the board where the buzzers are to speak into the office. I think lots of people buzz that and then they stand at the door and then they find it very difficult to hear us because the speaker is coming out of that buzzer board. Okay. And in case of any issues, you can call the office, or if you didn't get an answer from the office, maybe the office phone is busy, the Amanda in the office might be on the phone, or maybe she's just popped to the loo or something. You should have your assessor details with their telephone number on your booking letter. So again, it's sort of being prepared, having those things ready. Because everything comes through via email, I know for some people, on the spot, trying to find that information, searching through emails can be quite tricky. So if it helps you, maybe print it out or write that information somewhere separately in your phone, if that's what you tend to use for information, but have it somewhere separate so that you're not having to hunt through emails, will mean that just less stress, more preparation, and make that whole process a bit smoother, more comfortable for everyone. Okay, so what I'm going to move on now for our last few minutes is talking about what happens after the assessment, and then we'll have time for a few questions at the end if there is any. So what happens after the assessment, directly after? So each assessor works in their own way. Some might give initial feedback straight away at the appointment, but some might do that at a later date. You shouldn't necessarily expect it's going to be straight away. It will depend on the assessor and also a few other factors, which I'll come on to in a minute. So the feedback, if it's not done on the day of the assessment at the same time, is normally via telephone, and we normally aim to do that within a week. So you're not having to wait a long time for feedback from that and for a decision to be made. Whether immediate feedback is possible does depend on many factors. So we always take into account your child and their needs and how they've got on. If they are absolutely shattered and just want to be gone, because they've worked so hard and they're tired out, then we probably wouldn't deliver feedback, because they're going to be sitting there and probably start to feel a bit fed up of being there. Even if they've enjoyed it, they just want to be done. We also cannot always give that immediate feedback depending on the information that's come out of the assessment. Sometimes we need more time to look through that information. Sometimes we might not, for example, have had the school information, and that we feel is really important. So there's lots of things that will impact whether we can do that feedback straight away. It's not, this isn't a dyslexia assessment. It's not like a blood test where, boom, boom, put it in a machine, come out, it's dyslexic or not. It's much more complex than that. So we need to allow time for that where it's, where needed in terms of that initial feedback. What does verbal feedback include? So we will give you during that conversation a summary of a child's performance on the different tests and what that means. So how they've got on, where their performance lies within those different areas. So the strengths, the weaknesses, and the cognitive processing areas that they might be struggling with. A decision about dyslexia would normally be given at that stage. Occasionally, we might need further information. So some cases are more complex than others, and we might ask you to maybe give us a bit of extra information about other things, or we might, as I say, be waiting for school stuff. There could be, occasional reasons why we might not make that decision at that point in time, but typically we do. We might give some brief suggestions as to recommendations, but most of that will come in the written report, and that typically is because there's a lot to go through and a lot to explore, and it would be just too much to really sort of go through all of that on the phone normally. But if you have got some specific things that are happening right now for your child and you feel like you really want some advice on, we will do our best to offer some initial advice on that. And really importantly as well, that verbal feedback includes the chance to offer further information or ask questions. So as I mentioned earlier, there's often lots of things during that feedback process that are shared, which are really helpful and important for us to know about. And you may have specific questions that you want to ask. Of course, you can do that then. And that process normally takes around 20 to 30 minutes. Following that, if you've booked for a written report, you will receive the written report depending on the assessor's working hours roles in terms of the turnaround time, but standard turnaround time is around 4 to 6 weeks from the date of the assessment. Can be longer over holiday periods. Obviously, people are ill sometimes. There's other things that influence, but that's what we try and work towards. And that is sent to you via email as a PDF. If you need a printed copy because you feel like that'll be helpful, then just let us know and we can do that. But typically, most people find the PDF is the most helpful way nowadays to have that information. How should you communicate the outcome to this school? So lots of parents will ask us, will you send this report to the school? Will you tell them the outcome? So due to GDPR, the report is only sent to you. You have booked the appointment. Your child is our client. You and your child are our clients. So we cannot do anything with that report apart from send it to you legally. Unless you give our express permission, in which case we can, if you want us to, send it to the school. But typically, we would suggest that now is a good time, if you haven't had much communication, to start opening up those doors of communication with the school, with the SENCO. So we would suggest you forward that report via email to the school, give them a week or two to look through it, and then schedule a meeting with the SENCO to talk through next steps, formulate a plan of action. So that typically, if a child's been given a diagnosis of dyslexia, we would recommend that they are given a support plan at SEN level, and that's what you can be asking the school for, and that would normally come as a recommendation in the report. Talk through what support they're going to put in place and a plan of action. So when that will be reviewed termly, for example, we'll have another meeting or a conversation about that. And for a lot of parents, this is great first step to begin that next journey of support for their child. Some basic information, which is also on our website, but just to give you the information about charges. So first of all, just to highlight that as a charity, our fees are highly subsidised. So while we absolutely appreciate that the charges are not minimal amounts of money, it is a lot less than you would be charged elsewhere for an assessment. And the standard fee for an assessment, for example, from one of the major national dyslexia charities, is £500 to £600 plus for an assessment. Our assessment with verbal feedback only is £185. Our assessment with standard report is £295. With the extended report for those older age groups, £449. And the Form 8 exam access arrangements is £70. It's a much shorter assessment. The Form 8 exam access arrangements one doesn't come with a written report, because what we do is complete the form that the school need to submit to the exams board. So that process is the assessment plus us filling that form in, basically. The other thing we obviously get asked a lot is about waiting times, and while it's positive that we've got lots of people coming to us with dyslexia assessments, because it means we can offer the support that we do, that our wait times are longer than they ever have been in terms of demand, and they have been for quite a while, because people want these assessments, they need them, they respect how we do them, and there's very few other places we can get that done as well. But a lot of that comes down to the service that we're offering in terms of all this wraparound support. So for those under the age of 14, for whether it's a verbal or a standard report, so assessment with verbal feedback or written, we're now operating a waiting list for spring 2025. And that probably fairly soon will then be moved to summer 2025. We have now 3 assessors working within our team, but they all do other things as well. So myself included, we are not assessing all of the time. We couldn't be anyway in terms of writing up reports. It just isn't practical. So we are doing as many as we can, but that's where we're at in terms of numbers. An online extended assessment for age 14 plus, we have an external assessor who works and does those ones. So that typically at the moment will be around November, December this year, that you'd be able to get booked in for that. So there is a much shorter waiting list for that. And our Form 8 assessments in terms of timescale would be on inquiry, because they're much shorter point. We can normally fit them in, and there tends to be less of them. So that would be on inquiry. You could find out about that. Okay, I've just realised it's 11 o'clock. I didn't realise I was going to talk for so long. So let me just turn our recording off, and if people want to hang around for questions, they can. If there's any other questions and you don't want to ask them now, or you don't have time, you can always get in touch via our normal methods.